looking at quadratics now, but we're going to look away from the parabola part, the graph, and we're going to look at solving them, so strictly as an equation. So what we're going to talk about first is the multiplication property of 0. So essentially what that means is that anything times 0 is going to be 0. So what that looks like, let's just say we have any number. Let's just say 14 times 0. Yep, still 0. 1005 times 0, still 0. Anything times 0 is the result is going to be 0. So we're going to use that to be able to help us with our first tool, if you will, for solving these quadratics, and we're going to use that by factoring. So remember when we factored in Unit 7, we looked at finding, it looked like we had a binomial times a binomial, and that we just left it at that. So now we're going to use that. We're going to say two things multiplied to each other, and they're going to be equal to 0. So if one of those things has to be 0. That's the whole point of all of this as far as finding or talking about the multiplication property of 0. So what I want to make sure we're kind of clear on, we've talked about this a little bit, is we looked at standard form before, but just in this stance. So just where ax squared plus bx equals c. We did not have that equals 0 part. So that's a part that we're going to have for when we start solving, because if we're going to solve, we have to have an equation. If we have an equation, we have to have an equal sign. So this is a standard form for any kind of quadratic, especially when we go to solve. So you want to have 0 on one side, and you want everything else on the other side. So if it's not there, you got to move it there. So let's take a look at some of these examples. So the first example, we're going to solve this quadratic by factoring. We're going to factor this piece here. So I'm going to find two things that multiply together to give me x squared plus 11x plus 24. So remember, I'm going to find factors of 24. So two things that multiply to give me 24. But when I add them, I'm going to get 11. So I just start off with 1 times 24. That gives me 25 if I add them. So that's not it. 2 times 12. But when I add them, I don't get 11. I get 14. 3 times 8. When I add them, I get 11. When I multiply them, I get 24. And stop there. So I'm going to write my parentheses. So I have x plus 3 times x plus 8. So remember, just kind of retracking back on factoring. So 3 is here, 8 here. Doesn't matter the order. So here I have two things, x plus 3 and times x plus 8. And when I multiply them together, I'm going to get 0. So this is where that property comes into play. What do we know about one of those things? Well, one of those things has to be 0. So either from here, either x plus 3 has to be 0 or x plus 8 has to be 0. So one of those two things has to happen. So from here, I can now solve for x because I have just a linear equation. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides on this equation, so on the left equation. And I'm going to have x is equal to negative 3. And then on the other one, I'm going to subtract 8 from each side. And I'm going to have x is equal to negative 8. So I just solved a quadratic using the multiplication property of 0 by factoring. And when I factor, remember I'm finding two things that multiply together to give me something else. Okay, so that's, in this sense, it's a polynomial or trinomial. And when I do that, I know that one of those things has to be 0. So then I can split it up, solve from there. All right, so this one's a little bit more challenging because I have a number in front of x squared. I know, bummer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find factors of 12 because I get 2 times 6. It's not just the last number anymore because I have a number in front of x squared. So I'm going to find factors of 12 and that are going to add together to give me 13. So I'm going to have 1 times 12. When I add them together, I get 13. This is when the one you have to use the box for. So I'm going to have 2x squared and a plus 6 plus 1x plus 12x. And then find greatest common factors. So greatest common factor for the left column is going to be 2x, and greatest common factor on the right is going to be a 1. And then greatest common factor on the top row is going to be x, and on the bottom is going to be 6. So my two factors are 2x plus 1 times x plus 6 is equal to 0. So what do I know about one of those two things? One of them is 0. So one of those two factors, okay, so here's a factor and here's a factor. One of those has to be 0. So either 2x plus 1 is equal to 0 or x plus 6 is equal to 0. And then I can go from there. So I'm going to solve the left one first. So I have minus 1 on each side. So I have 2x equals negative 1. And then divide by 2 on each side. And so x is going to be equal to negative 1/2 on that one. Then on the other one, I'm going to subtract 6 from each side. And so x is equal to negative 6. And then that's how I would solve that here. Again, just a little bit more challenging, especially since you have a two-step equation in this part here. That's a two-step equation, but a little bit more involved here because you have to use the box to factor. All right, last one, you'll notice that I don't have 0 on one side. So notice I have x squared minus 3x is equal to 18. So guess what I have to do? Got to move it over to make 0 on one side. So I want everything on one side. So I'm going to subtract 18 from each side. So I get x squared minus 3x minus 18 equals 0. So I must do that so I can use the multiplication property of 0 so that I know that one of those two factors has to be 0. So I'm going to find factors of negative 18. Them over here, negative 18, that when I add them, I get negative 3. So 1 times negative 18, that's going to give me a negative 17. If I were to flop the negative sign, it's not going to give me the 3 I'm looking for. 2 times negative 9, that's going to give me negative 7. If I flop the negative sign, it's going to give me positive 7, which is still not what I'm looking for. And then I have 3 times negative 6, which is negative 3. So this is going to be my factors here. So when I come over here to write them, I'm going to have x plus 3 times x minus 6 is equal to 0. So I just factored x squared minus 3x minus 18 equals 0. It becomes x plus 3 times x minus 6. Then I'm going to have 2, so this factor or this factor, one of those has to be 0. So either x plus 3 is equal to 0 or x minus 6 is equal to 0. When I go to solve now, those are my two equations. Now I'm going to solve for x. So I'm going to subtract 3 on each side. And so x is equal to negative 3. Or I'm going to add 6 to both sides. And x is equal to 6. So just kind of wrapping all this up. So you're going to have to factor first. And then once you find there's two factors, you're going to set both of those factors equal to 0 and solve both of those. Remember, when you have a two-step equation, you want to add or subtract first, then multiply or divide. Mainly probably just going to divide. And then within one step, you're just going to add or subtract, moving it to the other side, which typically just changes the sign. So finding factors first, then set both of those factors equal to 0 and solve from there. And that's it. But what makes this hard is that factoring piece. So if you have questions, be sure to ask.